Hello and welcome to the Ascending Crows podcast. This is your host, Sam Roloski, and this week's guest is Peter Savastano. Peter is a professor of religion and, I believe, anthropology. He is also an Episcopal priest, and he started his spiritual journey in the Eastern traditions and actually traveled to Tibet and studied under a Tibetan Buddhist master from the Nyingmapa tradition, and as well as the religion of Bon, which is more native and indigenous to Tibet. The practice he guides us through is actually from the Sufi Islamic tradition, and I believe actually comes from a saying or poem from Rumi. So please sit back and find a comfortable seat and be ready to be guided in an exploration by Peter Savastano.
Ascending Crows Podcast.
So my name is Peter Savastano, and I am, among other things, an anthropologist of religion and a scholar, actually, of many of the world's religious traditions. I teach at nearby Seton Hall University, and I've been pretty much in this area most of my life. And one of the things I have been actually discussing with my students in Religions of the World course that I'm teaching this semester is the role that light plays in pretty much all of the religious traditions of the world. And in this time of great struggle and uncertainty for all of us with what is going on the planet, I've been really using light as a source of meditation. So I'm going to begin with a light meditation and also with a prayer, actually from the Islamic tradition, the Sufis, which are Islamic mystics. And it's actually a prayer for light. And we don't know exactly who wrote it, but it was written somewhere in the 14th century by a member of the Mevlevi lineage of Sufis, which is probably most famous for its founder, Jalaluddin Rumi. So I'm going to ask everyone who may be listening to this to just take a moment and put your feet flat on the ground if you can do so, and let your hands gently fall into your lap, and straighten your back and your spine a little, but don't be rigid about it. And take a moment and tune into your breath. Don't try to change your breathing. Just tune into it, find its rhythm, and allow the rhythm of your inhalation and your exhalation to bring you to a place of stillness and relaxation. And as I recite this prayer, I'm going to ask you to visualize light in all of the places that this prayer mentions. Oh God, give me light. Light above me, light below me, light to my right, light to my left. Give me light, O God, in my eyes and on my tongue and in my ears and on my skin and in my blood and in my bones. Give me light in my heart. Fill it with your light, that I may be the light that is you, that is your being. O God, give me light, light to my left, light to my right, light before me, light behind me, light in all of my internal organs, light in my fingers, light in my feet, light surround me. O God, fill me with light. Amen.
Powerful. Thank you. Thank you for sharing.
I like that.
Yeah. So this comes from the Sufi tradition, you said?
Yeah.
And I don't know too much of the Sufi tradition, but I'm really interested in the practices of the dervish, and especially the spinning. And it seems like this focal point of light seems to really sort of still represent that, in terms of its very fiery imagery, right? It really has that element of creation and energy. So how did you first encounter this practice?
So I encountered it actually through what you just described. So the Mevlevi are actually the Sufis that turn, or known as whirling dervishes. And many years ago, I took turning classes. So I was really interested in learning the mysticism, the spiritual practice of that kind of ecstatic, deeply contemplative dancing. And there is a prayer book that many Sufi lineages pray from, and each of them have prayers and poems that are particular to the founder of their particular lineage. And those prayer books are called weirds, not weird as in W-E-I-R-D. It's spelled W-I-R-D. So this prayer is called the Prayer for Light, and it's in the Mevlevi weird, of which I have a copy, and over the years on and off have used to pray from on a daily basis.
Interesting. So when we initially spoke, you told me that your really first ordination is in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition of the Nyingma, correct?
That's
I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly.
Nyingmapa,
right?
Or Nyingma, you can say it that way.
Oh, it's either one. Okay,
yes.
Sure. I wasn't sure. And to my understanding, that this tradition is supposed to trace its lineage to Padmasambhava, or it's based on the teachings of Padmasambhava, and it's sort of the original Buddhist school of Tibet?
That's probably not quite accurate.
Okay.
So, with most things, spiritual and religious, especially reaching into the past, separating out myth, and I don't mean myth here in terms of dismissing, but separating out the sacred story or narrative on which a tradition is based, and the historical facts are often two very different things.
Right.
But yes, and I don't know if I would actually use the ordination, the word ordination.
Okay.
That's such a Christian word.
Right. Yeah.
So what I did do is I took something called Nyingmapa vows, and the Nyingmapa lineage is probably most famous. For example, the lineage to which the Dalai Lama belongs, the Gelugpa, they are mostly exclusively monks. So it's rooted in monasticism, whereas the Nyingmapa tradition, sometimes referred to, depending on which scholars you read, as the old school lineage, they were mostly lay yogis. So they have a whole tradition of what are called sort of crazy wisdom figures who pursue enlightenment through the breaking of taboos, for example.
Right. Yeah.
And so, yes, that's the tradition that I was first exposed to, and that was way back in 1976 or 77. I was about 25 years old at the time, and I actually had the very good fortune of taking refuge and becoming part of that lineage with His Holiness Dujum Rinpoche, Jigdral Yeshe Dorje, and I was also a student of his eldest son, Tokul Tinley Norbu, for quite a number of years.
I've come across these names a lot, and because I'm very interested in studying, the literature of contemporary Tibetan scholars.
Right.
And these are very, highly regarded people, holders of a current of energy.
Right.
Did you ever receive? Or were you there for empowerments?
Many.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
What is? I sorry. I don't want to focus too much on this. I'd like to get back to the practice eventually, but I just have a couple questions first on your study of Tibetan Buddhism.
Right.
What is that experience like to sort of be in these the presence of these rituals where you are receiving these empowerments and really having a very intimate moment with your teachers?
Yeah. Well, I wish I could tell you that in the moment I received some of the most powerful, and by the way, the empowerments are called wangs. So there's two ways you can be given a practice in the Vajrayana Buddhist tradition in general. One is called a lung, spelt like our word lung.
Right.
And what happens then is if it is deemed appropriate and you have requested it, a lama will then give you authorization to do a particular practice.
Okay.
And usually the way that works is they read very rapidly in Tibetan the entire text in your presence, and then you are authorized. Wangs are very different. They really have a lot to do with mental telepathy on some level. And so there's a very elaborate ritual. There's a number of people. Some of these wangs take 2 and 3 days to do. And so there's a series of chantings, and you are instructed to do very certain kinds of visualizations.
Right.
And then the Lama who is providing the empowerment will transmit to you from his mind stream the energies that will make it possible for you to realize the fruits of the particular practice.
Right. It's this such careful precision to ritual that I, at least I've seen from such an outside perspective of these Tibetan traditions. Not only what you're describing, but also the practice of mandalas.
Yes.
It seems like really is. I mean, it almost seems contradictory to, again, what the Western opinion of Buddhism should be like, which is simplicity and really sort of just letting things be. But there is such a precision when it comes to the Tibetan tradition. How did this come about to be? Is this because it takes its root from the tradition of Bon as well, or is this just something culturally unique to Tibetan Buddhism?
So I just want to back up for
Sure.
1 minute, and then I'll say something about it. So the reason why I was telling you this was to respond to your question of what it was like for me to receive these empowerments. And unfortunately, even though I know I benefited from the empowerments, in the moment, I don't think I understood the tradition well enough. I was very new to it to know completely what was going on. And even though I was instructed to sit in silence and open my mind to receive the Wang, I don't think I understood what that meant and how it operated in the way that I do now. So I probably didn't benefit from it as completely as I could. So to just jump a little forward to answer your most recent question to the best of my ability, a lot of that I am only recently discovering is very up in the air. So some of the scholarship I've been exploring lately, I always thought in my very simplistic kind of thinking that since Buddhism is 600 years old than Christianity, and since I know there was loads of exchange of ideas and ritual practices by way of the Silk trade route, that somehow, some way, Buddhist practices must have influenced Christianity. And so recently I am discovering that there is a more likely chance it was the other way around. That in the earliest centuries of the Christian tradition, the Mahayana tradition of Buddhism wasn't even established yet.
Right.
And we know that Christians and Christian monks from the Syriac Eastern Church made their way into China and Tibet, where they actually referred to Christianity as the religion of light. It wasn't the only influence, and particularly the writings of an Egyptian monk by the name of Evagrius of Pontus, who actually lived a number of places, but one of them was in the deserts of Egypt. And his writings, which are still available today, particularly one collection called the Practicos and the chapters on prayer, are actually, some scholars think, the source of Dzogchen.
Really?
The development of the Dzogchen tradition, and even what's known as rainbow body in Tibetan Buddhism and Bon, actually learned a lot of ritual things and the use of light as part of this exchange. Now, there were also influences from Manichaeism and also from Islam. So I remember talking a little bit about this in our first conversation, but that to me is so amazing, because I've only ever heard, Dzogchen as being this Tibetan Bon tradition, right? So I in my own head, envision this to be so unique to the culture and people of Tibet. I mean, and certainly it is, right? But it seems like what you're saying here is that actually that Dzogchen is influenced through, the understandings of Christianity and other Abrahamic traditions, and that this idea of resurrection and the rainbow body are really mirroring each other, and that they're sort of describing this same spiritual phenomenological thing that's it's been discussed in these these seemingly two very different traditions. Yeah, I think so. But I think also, in the interest of fairness, it's probably more accurate to say, and I think this is just the case for all religious traditions, they sort of cross-pollinate each other.
Right.
So, yes, some ideas may have come to what we know today as Dzogchen from Christianity and Islam, and even from Shivite Hindu tantric practices and Manichaeism, but also ideas from the Buddhist tradition. I can say also, and this was something I learned firsthand because I was for a few years the student of a Bon master, and many people think that all of the seemingly shamanic elements of religion in Tibet come from the Bon, and I could tell you they are much more structured and have much more of a rigidity than the Nyingmapa are ever going to have. And in fact, one of the things there's like in Bon, I think it's much more strictly adhered to, that there are certain stages that you must go through before you get the Dzogchen teachings.
Right.
You must go through the Nundro, or what's called the preliminary practices, which is a big thing because you have to do 100,000 of everything.
Right.
And, unless you're closed away in a cave and you can knock it off in 3 years, if you're a person like you and I out in the world, those are practices you could be doing for your entire life, depending on how diligently you do it. While there is certainly a graded path in Nyingmapa, the Nyingmapa lamas that I encountered and studied with would give teachings and empowerments from all the levels to anyone who was present and it seemed appropriate to do. So, that's probably one of the differences I could say from my own personal firsthand experience.
Right. And that it sounds like that tracks based on what you described in terms of the spiritual pursuits of the Nyingmapa, that you said it's sort of found in that in-between area of breaking certain taboos that, that monastics aren't supposed to practice. It seems like the Bon tradition seems to adhere more to what a traditional monastic lifestyle would be like.
Yeah. And while I don't know this for certain because I haven't really had a lot of interaction with the Gelugpa lineage of Tibetan Buddhism, I can say that the Nyingmapa, and I think probably the Bon to some degree, I mean, they have lay practitioners that I know, but I can say probably the Nyingmapa are the most experimental, and I know one of the teachers that I had, Togul Tinley Norbu, I mean, he was definitely in many ways, not quite in the same vein as Chogyam Trungpa, but he was definitely one of those crazy wisdom, really challenge the way your thinking is structured kind of lamas. And that was not always an easy or a pleasant experience.
Right. I haven't read the second guy you mentioned, but I've read a decent amount of Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche's books. And he seems really overly pessimistic and in certain times, and the things he says and the stuff that you hear about his lifestyle is like, whoa, like how does this stuff blend together? But then there also is this really radical compassion that comes out of his work, and it seems like some of us sort of need to break that taboo and place ourselves in this sort of chaotic state so we can sort of understand that need for compassion, and that is being radical and having radical amounts of compassion are pretty almost go hand in hand a lot, especially when you observe the life of Christ and how radically he was opposed to the occupiers of his territory. It just seems like that sometimes we need to, and all these people who have started these traditions like Christianity and Buddhism, they were breaking the mold that they were coming out of, and that's a lesson that Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche and these what was the term you used for breaking taboos, but
the crazy wisdom,
exactly. Yes. That too is really illustrates what the nature of reform. So I'd like to go back just a little bit to the practice you shared with us. Would you say that it was sort of necessary to start where you did in your spiritual seeking to lead to these other pathways? Did that sort of help you? Like you said, you certainly learned to open your mind and it's, I guess, gain a little bit of focus from the practices. Do you think that was necessary to lead you to the next step of practicing these other traditions?
Well, I think there were a lot of things going on. As I look back on it in retrospect, obviously, with a last name like Savastano, I'm from an Italian Catholic family with a slight twist, and that is actually half of my family was Jewish. My father's mother was Jewish. I have a number of aunt and uncles. My paternal grandmother was married before she met my grandfather and married him and had children with him. So she had children from another marriage. They were all Jewish. Some of them converted to Catholicism. So I had all that kind of stuff going on in my history. But I grew up in nearby Newark, New Jersey, in what was the Little Italy section of Newark at the time. It's no longer there anymore. I came of age at the height of the 1960s. I was in high school from 1966 to 1970. So you can imagine, I'm sure, what that was like. And I guess on some level, I got zapped by the spiritual explorations that went along with the 1960s, the kind of flooding of American life with all sorts of incredible ideas from Asian religious traditions, among other things. And but there was also another element that really kind of propelled me to do all of this searching. And that is, I was also at the time coming to terms with being a gay person and coming from a religious tradition that still to this day teaches, as the Catholic Church does, that I and people like me are morally and intrinsically disordered and inclined towards moral evil if we engage in homosexual activities, which in my mind is saying it's okay to be a dancer, but you just can't dance, or it's okay to be a singer, but you just can't sing, So that created a huge crisis, especially being that young. And so I guess one of the most motivating factors of my entire journey, and when I did eventually go to graduate school, people often, I was working full-time in healthcare administration, and I left that world to go to graduate school and get a PhD in religion. And what motivated me was I wanted to know, is it true that every single religious tradition in the world condemns homosexual people and homosexual activity? And so that was really what led me to sort of leave no stone unturned. And while for different reasons, it was also a pattern that Thomas Merton himself traveled in his own life. And I don't think I realized when I first encountered him and his writings that he was kind of a prototype for my own journey. I didn't realize that until maybe about 7 or 8 years ago. I teach a course actually at Seton Hall entitled Thomas Merton, Religion and Culture. And I remember 2 of the students saying to me in one of the times I taught it that my life looked in many ways like Thomas Merton, except I never became a Trappist monk, but I did many of the things that he did, explored all these different religious traditions, tried on different types of spiritual practice and stuff like that. So, I'd say at least initially that was those issues were a big part of what motivated me.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, eventually it became much more than that, just the richness of each of these traditions.
Did you find that acceptance and openness for who you are from those other traditions, or did you find that they are just as limiting and divisive as traditions in our part of the world as well?
Well, certainly in Buddhism, generally I did. And, many LGBTQI persons are very attracted to Buddhism, but they should not think that all Buddhist teachers are not homophobic. In fact, I'm sure some of his students would be very upset for my putting it this way. But what I can tell you is, Tokul Tinley Norbu, my teacher, the thing that he constantly harped on with me was my being gay. And in his critiques of me, he would say things to me like, I operate an all-girl style. And stuff like that, which actually, believe it or not, even though it hurt immensely at the time, it did liberate me. But in the way that it liberated me was not the way that you might think. I just sort of realized, you know what? That I'm not going to take in. That is not what my truth is, so to speak. So, that really was the kind of the end point of I did see him many, many years later, and we had some good conversations. So it really, really depends. I could tell you also, one of my areas of expertise is African diasporic religions, and particularly voodoo and voodoo here in the Haitian diaspora. And while a healing tradition like voodoo or lukumi or what some people will refer to as Santeria, those are often very embracing and hospitable to LGBTQI persons. There are still Ungans and Mambos, which are voodoo priests, or Santeros or Santeras who may be very homophobic. So the difference is, unlike the Catholic Church, there isn't a page in a catechism somewhere that says I am morally and intrinsically disordered in the way that it does in the Catholic catechism. And it really depends on the individual teacher.
Right. I mean, and that it really illustrates how these phobias and this hatred and divisiveness that is seeped into religious culture, it doesn't come from doctrine. It comes from that place that exists in the human psyche, which is fear of the unknown, fear of what is different from me. And I mean, my heart really broke hearing that story, because I feel so grateful to learn from spiritual teachers in your generation, because it seems like you guys really, I mean, of course, there's so much work that needs to be done today, but there's also so much more of this open understanding of what it is to be part of the LGBTQ community, and that we get to learn from spiritual teachers who have been abused by these horrifically just narrow-minded spiritual teachers. And I mean, I shouldn't even say that. I mean, because a part of me also feels bad for them, because they grew up in these traditions and had, maybe they have tremendous spiritual insight, but they still have a little bit of poison in there. Yeah. And so, I try to be understanding in that way too, but it's still there that he was your teacher and he made you feel that way. And it just, I couldn't imagine if a teacher, one of my teachers, did that to me. So yeah. I look up to people like you who have this resilience to still be this proponent in the world that is that is here to be a vessel of wisdom and a demonstration of strength.
Well, thank you. And I think you're right. What you just said makes me think of Ken Wilber, who I think makes a fairly convincing argument that just because a teacher may be highly realized spiritually doesn't mean that his or her level of emotional maturity is equivalent to their spiritual development. We know that from all the various sexually related scandals that go along with great teachers and gurus and so forth and so on. So high levels of development in one area of our psyche doesn't guarantee that it's across the board. Right. So you can be highly spiritually developed and also still very much conditioned by your own culture and your worldview, and not have enough reflexivity or ironic distance to even see that is your conditioning. And in many ways, that is a limitation in and of itself.
Absolutely. And it seems, so I want to tie in what we're talking about a little bit to the practice you led us through earlier today, because it seems so contradictory that we can have this lapse in awareness, socially, interpersonally, and develop this, have these, so-called, practices like Vipassana that are supposed to, really be this constant, I don't want to say filtering, but observing of our thoughts and sort of, I mean, the way at least I've experienced Vipassana is through applying a koan, or something like that, and then to sort of analyze how, what does that make you feel? What is that sort of, what direction does that point you in? And it seems like the focal point of light that you were giving us earlier really sort of mirrors that sort of awareness, right? That interpersonal relationship that we have with the divine presence or with God. So I sort of have two questions. The first would be is why is light such a universal focal point that we use in sort of like an awareness meditation, and why? How do we have to keep challenging ourselves to have this social awareness? Why is it that we can't just rely on the practice? Why is it that we have to implement it to really understand that awareness?
Yeah. Wow, I don't know if I could answer all of that, but I'm willing to, try to answer as much of it as I can. So first of all, I'm just thinking about this along anthropological lines, right? So
Sure.
if, one of the big things that always interests me about anthropology is its need and desire to understand every facet of human existence, right? And what is it at the most primordial level about being human that eventually develops into what we think of as religion, right? It's rooted in some very basic survival things. And one of them is being on a planet such as ours, you suddenly figure out that thing called the sun out there and the light that comes from it is absolutely essential for our survival, right? So, just at that primal level, light. And we also know what it is like to be in the dark. It's difficult to hunt in the dark. Yeah. It's difficult to do a lot of things in the dark, even to do rituals, even in the caves that they have found all of this incredible ancient cave paintings. There had to be fire in order for those cave walls to be painted. So, and our human capacity to take very concrete things and turn them into symbols, which is one of our cognitive capacities. I think at the most basic level, that's where the light part comes from.
Right.
Now, what you do with that and what creates that level of awareness. So, there's a couple ways I think about this. One is, and I'll use myself as an example, right? I mean, before my encounters with this particular Lama around the sexuality issues, one of the things that drew me to Buddhism and also drew me at one point to the Quakers was this whole idea that everybody has to find your own way, right? And that if you have this light inside of you or this Buddha nature, it is what you are hoping to cultivate a connection to and to live out of. So in a tradition such as Roman Catholicism, where I came from, I went around to all these lamas. I can't tell you how many lamas I talked to about being gay. And, many of them gave me answers that I liked, and some of them gave me answers like, well, from the point of view of absolute reality, it doesn't matter at all. But from the point of view of relative reality, it matters a lot. So, that could be troubling to kind of walk away from too. So I think that what happened is knowing this whole idea. I mean, what I was doing with them was the same, because I was raised Catholic and used to having some authority, a priest authority or the Pope or whatever, say, this is what the truth is, this is what you have to do, this is what you can't do. And we know because we're the church and we have the truth. I was going around looking for all of these Tibetan lamas to tell me it was okay to be gay. And in that moment with Tinley Norbu, the reason why I walked away was I realized I don't need Suddenly the little light went on, if you could call it enlightenment light, I don't know. But the little light went on that said, you know what? You're going about this all wrong. You need to know that and decide that for yourself, right? And that was kind of the moment where I sort of realized, you know what? On some level, whatever teachings I got from Buddhism, they actually worked because I had enough sense to trust my own inner light, for lack of a better word. And then many years later, when I was in graduate school, I remember reading a book by a psychologist of religion by the name of James Fowler. And I don't remember, the title of the book was Stages of Spiritual Development. And his argument is that as you become more and more spiritually developed and mature, you begin to make choices, even if you adhere to a particular tradition, about what you're going to accept and what you're not. Right. And so I realized, not that I'm claiming to be a highly religiously or spiritually mature person, but that did become my necessity if I was going to survive. So that was really what it is. And sometimes when I teach some of these religion classes, or even in my own church work now, people say to me, well, my minister told me this is not cafeteria religion. You can't pick and choose what you want. You have to take the whole thing or you're out. Well, not according to James Fowler. The sign of a religiously and spiritually mature person is, I'll have some of this and no thanks, I don't want any of that.
That's what I really love about the Western magic traditions, is that it really illustrates that I should say, Western, occult or mystical traditions, that come from high magic or ceremonial magic, is that, there is that, the ceremonial part, there is that, part of conforming to the group in some part, but it really seems, like what you were talking about before is what's, referred to as the true will of the magician. When you really start to, perceive yourself or your soul, if you want to use that term, that you align with who you are, what your natural gifts are, what your natural attractions are, and that this is a path to understanding your natural self, right? And how that your natural self accords with the other, greater natural self.
Yes.
And that really, it seems so silly that a Buddhist would say something of the opposite, because I don't know how accurate this quote is, but there's this famous quote from Shakyamuni Buddha that says, if anything that I'm preaching disaccords with your personal view of the way the world is, you shouldn't believe it, because I'm not you. You may have a greater piece of the truth that I don't have. And it seems like that, this is the way, us, Westerners view, like, oh, this is how all Buddhists are, right? We eliminate the total possibility that there is just as much religious dogma that can come out of these traditions. And that it's so disappointing when we encounter that for the first time.
Absolutely. And, along those lines, I have friends who actually grew up in Buddhist families, and when they encounter this in us Westerners, they laugh, and I have one friend, and she says, I'm still in therapy trying to recover from being raised Buddhist.
Oh, man.
And so I don't know where you all get this idea that it's just one big happy multicultural diversity celebration of anything goes. That's certainly not the Buddhism that I grew up with, and I think, okay, at almost 70 years old, I guess on some level, I'm still in therapy from having grown up Catholic. So, I get it.
That's the phrase that we hear all the time. I'm in therapy for going to Catholic school, right? So
that's right.
Yeah, it's an important lesson for us too. Not only to set up unrealistic expectations of the way we think these traditions should be, but to also point out and say like, hey, you were looking around the world, but there's so much spiritual wealth in your own tradition, the tradition you were born into.
So true.
And that's something that really I'm coming to terms with now, because I have been so drawn to specifically Chinese Buddhism, and the schools of philosophy that tie to my practice in the martial arts, and even just certain sayings from Jesus. Actually, my mom explained to me that Jesus, telling people to turn the other cheek, isn't actually just a pacifist thing. It actually shows a little bit of martial knowledge, because you could only use your right hand to slap or to hit somebody. I believe so. It could have been, but it was only one of the hands. If you use your left hand, that you were shaming yourself, because that's not the hand you're supposed to use for that kind of actions. So by turning the other cheek, you're actually inviting them to hit you using their left hand. That's very challenging.
Right.
And when I started seeing that I mean, because it's so silly to me now that I think that like, Christianity is all about falling in line, and I was like, no, Jesus was the most radical person of his era.
Yeah.
And that, when I saw that through the lens of martial arts, I was like, whoa, there has to be a lot more. And I haven't done as much, study and reading the Bible as I should, but I'm at least revering that as a tome of spiritual knowledge, rather than just some cultural control mechanism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think I agree with you. I remember reading, I don't remember which book it was in, but one of the Dalai Lama's books, where he actually advises people not to convert to Buddhism. And he says, you have probably all that you are looking for in Buddhism, you will find in your own tradition,
right,
if you know where to look for it. And I think, as someone who attempted to convert to a number of religious traditions, the reason why I am a Christian and an Episcopal priest is because I realized, in many ways, the tradition that one is born into, you can't really walk away from
right.
it. It is so deep within you.
Right.
And in fact, in a moment of real crises, it's your default symbol system. And I know in my own case, I realized that, particularly when I was so immersed in Tibetan Buddhism, every year when Christmas would come around, I would show up and request these audiences with all these lamas, because I wanted Jesus and I didn't know what to do with it. And finally, one of the lamas said to me, well, there's one practice that you do in the preliminary, and that's called going for refuge and the Bodhisattva vow. And you have to do it 100,000 times. And what you have to picture before you, visualize, is what's called the refuge field or object. And that's usually, in the case of the Nyingmapa, it's an elaborate image, and it has Padmasambhava sitting on the Dhanakosya lake on a lotus in the middle, and then around it are all the deities, all the teachers of the lineage, and that's what you're taking refuge in. And so finally, this one Nyingmapa Lama said to me, well, if you want Jesus, put him in there, put him in the refuge object, right? But it didn't do it.
Right.
It just didn't do it enough. And with all of the problems, I mean, the kind of heterosexual supremacy that is built into Christianity, and some of that is changing now. Despite all of that, I realized, you know what? There's no escaping who you are. So you better find a way to make the best out of being a Christian that you possibly can, knowing what you know, and allow that to be enriched by the other traditions in which I have studied and practiced. And that's pretty much what I've done. Of course, I found a denomination of Christianity that looks, for all intents and purposes, very much like the Catholicism in which I grew up, with the exception of that they will ordain women, that LGBTQI persons can be married, not civil unions, as the Pope just recently, I thought, who wants second-class citizenship? Thank you if I don't get the full Megillah. And there was a kind of openness there. And there's sort of a model that some seminaries use about traditions, and it's called the three-stool model. And the Catholic churches is the three stools are scripture, tradition, and the teaching authority of the church. In the Episcopal Church, the three stools are scripture, tradition, and the use of reason. I'll take reason over the teaching magisterium of the church any day.
I mean, that seems to fall in line with your well, I shouldn't say, but because this is maybe drawing connection that's not there, but I mean, logic, it was something that was very much a part of a lot of Tibetan traditions, right?
Absolutely.
So I think that use of reason, sort of falls in line with your path.
Yes. But when I go back and I read particularly the early years of the emergence of monasticism in Christianity, I mean, to read some of those writers, and Thomas Merton did this himself when he wrote Wisdom from the Desert. He had all of his favorite apophthegmata, which are the sayings of the desert mothers and fathers, and he characterized them as being like Zen masters. You go to them and you ask them a question, and they give you some answer that you don't know when you're leaving the room whether you're where your ass or your head is, because you just so. And the richness of what was there, and particularly this mystic and contemplative theologian Evagrius. I mean, even very conservative commentators and translators of his work say, this guy is so Buddhist-like, you wonder how he's Christian.
Wow.
And it's really his writings are so non-dualistic in his approach to things.
That approach is so important, at least for me, in terms of seeing an authentic teacher, is because that's what I look for, when I need guidance, right? Is how do I get out of this constant me and other, right? And so I think encountering that is necessary for us as seekers. Peter, I think this is a great point for us to leave off. Thank you so much for joining us in this conversation. I learned so much about Tibetan Buddhism just now. I thought maybe we'd talk about a little bit other stuff, but wow, that was really such a great exploration. And thanks for sharing so much about your origins and embarking on a spiritual journey. I'd love to have another conversation sometime soon. We'll definitely
absolutely
open up a little bit more. But is there anything that you can tell our viewers? Is there anything you're currently working on? Books or anything cool?
I would say what I'm currently working on these days is getting from one day to the next with a semblance of peace and centeredness.
Absolutely.
And that's a lot of hard work. And how's that going? Some days better than others.
Hey.
And thank you for having me. It was a pleasure, and I'd love to do it again.
Great. Thanks so much, Peter.